Sometimes the cruelest moments reveal the deepest truths about human nature. Sometimes what breaks our heart also breaks open our capacity for grace. In Copper Ridge, Arizona, the townspeople thought they were delivering the perfect insult to an Apache warrior, Taza. Instead of a proud horse, they gave him a small donkey and laughed. But Taza placed his hand on the donkey's back and stayed silent. He came seeking peace, not revenge. He wanted to find harmony with the people now living on his ancestral lands. The townsfolk thought their joke would send him away humiliated. They were wrong. This simple act would change everything. The warrior and his unlikely companion would face dangerous trails together. When trouble threatened the town, they would return. Not for conquest, but for something far more powerful. Could one man's dignity transform an entire community's heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red dirt streets of Copper Ridge when Taza first appeared at the town's edge, leading a paint horse that had seen better days. The year was 1882, and the Arizona Territory still carried the scent of change in its desert winds. Most Apache had been driven onto reservations or deeper into Mexico, but Taza walked free, carrying himself with the dignity of a man who knew exactly who he was. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of his people's history, Taza moved through the world with quiet purpose. His long black hair was braided with strips of leather and adorned with a single eagle feather, a gift from his grandfather, Chief Nayarit, before the old man passed into the spirit world. Around his neck hung a medicine pouch made from soft doeskin, containing herbs and sacred stones that had protected 3 generations of warriors. But perhaps most striking was what Taza carried in his weathered hands, his father's war lance, wrapped carefully in red cloth and eagle feathers. The lance had drawn blood in defense of Apache lands for 30 years before his father, Manton, fell to cavalry bullets at the massacre of Skeleton Creek. Taza had sworn on his father's grave that this lance would never again taste blood in anger. Instead, it would serve as a reminder of what was lost and what might still be saved through different means. The town of Copper Ridge had grown like a desert flower around the promise of copper in the nearby hills. What started as a mining camp had evolved into a proper settlement with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and even a one-room schoolhouse. The people who had put down roots here were survivors, farmers who had learned to coax crops from stubborn soil, merchants who had followed the miner's money, and families seeking a fresh start far from the crowded cities back east. At the heart of the town's daily rhythm was Murphy's General Store, where news traveled faster than tumbleweeds and gossip was currency more valuable than silver. Thomas Murphy, a stout Irishman with calloused hands and a quick laugh, had built his business on treating everyone fairly, whether they were white settlers, Mexican vaqueros, or the occasional Apache who still traveled through the territory. The schoolhouse stood at the far end of Main Street, painted white with green shutters and surrounded by a small garden where children learned about plants alongside their arithmetic. Inside, Sarah McKenna taught 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. She had arrived from Boston 2 years earlier, drawn by the promise of making a real difference in a place where education could change lives. Sarah possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from knowing her own mind. Her auburn hair was always pinned back properly, but a few rebellious strands invariably escaped to frame her face. Her green eyes held intelligence and compassion, in equal measure, and she had a way of seeing potential in people that others had given up on. At 28, she was considered an old maid by Eastern standards, but in Copper Ridge, her dedication to the children had earned her respect that transcended social expectations. The most imposing figure in Copper Ridge was cattle baron Harrison Morrison, who had arrived 3 years earlier with enough money and political connections to acquire vast tracts of grazing land. Morrison owned the largest ranch within 100 miles and employed 30 men who were as comfortable with guns as they were with cattle. He had built a sprawling adobe house on a hill overlooking the town, complete with imported furnishings, and a wife who rarely ventured beyond her rose garden. Morrison's influence extended far beyond his ranch boundaries. He sat on the territorial legislature, had the ear of federal Indian agents, and made it known that he envisioned Copper Ridge becoming a proper city with himself as its guiding force. What Morrison didn't advertise was his belief that progress required the complete removal of all Apache from the territory, by whatever means necessary. When Taza first walked down Main Street, leading his aging paint horse, conversation stopped and curtains twitched at windows. Children peered around their mothers' skirts, while men let their hands drift closer to their sidearms. The last Apache warrior most of them had seen up close had been in chains, being transported to the reservation at San Carlos. But Taza showed no signs of hostility. He moved with the measured pace of a man who understood that every gesture would be scrutinized, every expression interpreted as either threat or submission. When he reached Murphy's store, he tied his horse to the hitching post and stepped onto the wooden boardwalk with boots that made no sound despite his size. "Morning," Thomas Murphy said carefully as Taza entered the store. The Apache warrior nodded respectfully and approached the counter where Murphy kept his ledger books and cash. "Mugs, I seek no trouble," Taza said in English that carried only the faintest accent. His voice was deep and measured, like distant thunder. "I come to trade and to speak of peace." Murphy studied the tall man before him, noting the absence of war. Paint, the careful way Taza kept his hands visible, and the genuine sincerity in his dark eyes. "What kind of trade you got in mind?" From a leather pouch, Taza produced several items. Turquoise stones polished to perfection, silver work of exquisite craftsmanship, and a small bundle of herbs that filled the store with a clean medicinal scent. These for supplies. Salt, flour, coffee, if you have it. Murphy examined the turquoise and silver, recognizing quality workmanship when he saw it. The stones were worth considerably more than basic supplies, but he had learned that fairness in small matters often prevented larger troubles. "This is fine work. Your people make these?" "My grandmother," Taza replied, before she walked the spirit trail. As Murphy gathered the requested supplies, Sarah McKenna entered the store for her weekly purchase of school materials. She paused when she saw Taza, but not with the fear that most white women displayed. Instead, her expression showed curiosity, and something that might have been recognition of shared purpose. "Miss McKenna," Murphy said, "this here is Taza. He's come to trade." Sarah stepped forward and extended her hand in greeting, a gesture that shocked everyone present, including Taza. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Taza. I teach at the school here." Taza looked at her offered hand for a long moment before accepting it briefly. "You teach all children?" "Any child who wants to learn," Sarah replied. "Learning knows no boundaries." Before Taza could respond, the store's door burst open and 3 of Morrison's ranch hands entered, led by a man named Jake Rawlings. Rawlings was Morrison's foreman, a hard man with quick fists and quicker prejudices. His eyes immediately fixed on Taza with unconcealed hostility. "Well, well," Rawlings said loudly. "Looks like we got ourselves a real live Apache right here in town. Murphy, you know it ain't safe having his kind around decent folk." Murphy's jaw tightened. "Mr. Taza is conducting business, Jake. Same as anyone else." "Business?" Rawlings laughed harshly. "Only business an Apache knows is stealing cattle and scalping settlers." The tension in the store became thick enough to cut. Sarah moved closer to the counter, her chin raised defiantly, while Murphy's hand moved toward the shotgun he kept behind the register. But it was Taza who broke the silence. "I have taken no cattle," he said calmly. "I have harmed no settler. I come in peace, seeking only to live on the land of my fathers." Rawlings spat tobacco juice onto Murphy's clean floor. "Your fathers are dead, Indian. This is white man's territory now. The earth belongs to no man," Taza replied. "We are all her children." The profound simplicity of the statement seemed to catch Rawlings off guard. He had come prepared for defiance or cowering, not philosophy. "You talk pretty words, but words don't change what you are." It was then that Harrison Morrison himself entered the store, drawn by reports of the Apache's presence. Morrison was a man who understood the power of appearances, well-dressed, perfectly groomed, and carrying himself with the authority that came from wealth and political connections. "Gentlemen," Morrison said smoothly, "I hope we're all conducting ourselves as civilized people should." His words were diplomatic, but his eyes studied Taza like a rancher evaluating potentially dangerous livestock. Morrison had not built his empire by underestimating opponents, and he recognized something formidable in the Apache warrior despite the peaceful words. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said firmly, "Mr. Taza was simply conducting business with Mr. Murphy. There's no cause for concern." Morrison smiled at Sarah with paternal condescension. "Miss McKenna, you generous heart does you credit, but perhaps you don't fully understand the complexities of our situation here." Taza gathered his supplies and placed coins on the counter to pay for them. The gesture was deliberate, showing that he had legal tender and conducted honest business. "I understand that fear makes men see enemies where none exist," he said to Morrison. "I offer no threat to your town or your people." "Generous words," Morrison replied. "But actions speak louder than words, don't they?" That evening, as Taza made camp in the hills above Copper Ridge, he found himself thinking about the day's encounters. The merchant Murphy had been fair. The teacher Sarah had shown unexpected courage. But Morrison represented something darker, the kind of man who would never accept any solution that didn't involve complete dominance. As he tended to his paint horse and prepared a simple meal, Taza felt the weight of his father's lance and the medicine pouch around his neck. 3 years had passed since the massacre at Skeleton Creek. 3 years of wandering and wondering if there could ever be a place for his people in this changing world. Coming to Copper Ridge had been an act of faith that understanding might bridge the gap between cultures. But as he settled down for the night under a canopy of desert stars, Taza couldn't shake the feeling that larger forces were already in motion. Morrison's eyes had held the cold calculation of a man planning war, not peace. And somewhere in the darkness beyond his campfire, Taza sensed that his true test was yet to come. The incident that would change everything began 3 days after Taza's first visit to town. He had been camped in a grove of cottonwoods near a small stream, living quietly and bothering no one. Each morning, he would tend to his paint horse and check the snares he had set for rabbits, careful to take only what he needed and to offer proper thanks to the spirits for their provision. On this particular morning, the sound of approaching horses broke the desert stillness. Taza counted at least 6 riders from their hoofbeats, moving fast and with purpose. He quickly secured his father's war lance in its wrappings and slipped the medicine pouch deeper into his shirt, then stepped into view with his hands clearly visible. The riders were Morrison's men, led by Jake Rawlings. They surrounded Taza's small camp with practiced efficiency, their hands resting on gumbutts. But it was what they had with them that made Taza's blood run cold. A small Apache family, bound and being dragged behind one of the horses. The man was old, perhaps 60, with silver streaking his long hair. The woman was younger, maybe 40, and she cradled a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. All 3 showed signs of rough handling, torn clothes, bruised faces, and the hollow look of people who had endured too much. Well, Rawlings said with a cruel grin. "Look what we found squatting on Mr. Morrison's land. Figured you might know these folks, seeing as how you're all the same kind. Taza recognized them immediately. The old man was Joseph Standing, Bear, who had once fought alongside Taza's father but had chosen the reservation when the wars ended. The woman was his daughter Mary, and the child was his granddaughter, Little Dove. They had been living peacefully on a small plot of land that the Indian agent had assured them was legally theirs. These people have done no wrong, Taza said, carefully, knowing that his next words could mean life or death for the family. They live where they were told to live. That's where you're wrong, Apache, Rawlings spat. They're trespassing on private property. Mr. Morrison bought this land fair and square from the territorial government. Taza's mind raced. He knew. The family's small farm was 5 miles from here, in a valley that had been explicitly set aside for Apache families who wanted to live peacefully among the settlers. Either Morrison's boundaries extended much farther than anyone realized, or this was something else entirely. Show me the boundaries, Taza said. Rawlings laughed. I don't have to show you nothing, Indian. But I'll tell you what's going to happen. These folks are leaving Apache lands permanently, and you're going to help us make sure the message gets across to any other redskins who might be getting ideas about staying. That's when Taza saw the burns on Little Dove's arms, fresh marks from a branding iron. They had tortured a child to make their point. The warrior's blood that had been kept in check by years of discipline suddenly roared in his ears. His hand moved involuntarily toward where his knife should have been, but he had deliberately left all weapons except his father's wrapped lance back at camp. You hurt a child, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Just gave her a little reminder of what happens to thieves, Rawlings replied. Course, if you want to make this difficult, we can give her a few more reminders. Before Taza could respond, another voice cut through the morning air. What in the name of all that's holy is going on here? Sarah McKenna rode into the clearing on a small bay mare, her school satchel bouncing against her hip. She had been out gathering wildflowers for her students' nature lessons when she heard the commotion. What she saw made her face go white with shock and then red with anger. Jake Rawlings, you release that family this instant, she commanded with the authority of a woman used to controlling unruly children. Now, Miss McKenna, Rawlings said, with false reasonableness, this ain't none of your concern. We're just removing some trespassers from Mr. Morrison's property. Sarah dismounted and strode directly to Little Dove, gently examining the burns on the child's arms. The girl whimpered and tried to hide behind her grandmother, but Sarah's touch was gentle and her voice soothing. These are brand marks, Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury. You branded a child like she was livestock. Just marking property that was trying to wander off, one of Morrison's men said with a laugh. That's when Sarah McKenna did something that shocked everyone present, including herself. She walked over to Rawlings' horse and pulled his rifle from its scabbard before he could react. You will release this family immediately, she said, pointing the weapon at Rawlings with steady hands. And then you will ride back to Mr. Morrison and tell him that if I ever see evidence of child abuse again, I will personally see the territorial authorities hear about it. Rawlings stared at the schoolteacher in disbelief. Lady, you have lost your mind. You're pointing a gun at white men to protect a bunch of savages. I'm pointing a gun at men who torture children, Sarah replied. There's a difference. Taza watched this extraordinary display of courage and felt something shift inside his chest. This white woman was risking her life, her livelihood, and her reputation to protect Apache children she had never met. It was an act of pure moral courage that transcended all boundaries of race and culture. Miss McKenna, he said quietly, perhaps there is another way. Sarah glanced at him, the rifle still trained on Rawlings. What do you suggest? Taza stepped forward, his hands still visible and non-threatening. I will come with you, he said to Rawlings. Release the family, and I will come peacefully to speak with Mr. Morrison about boundaries and property rights. Taza, no, Sarah said. They'll kill you. Perhaps, Taza replied, but the child will live. It was then that the most unexpected participant entered the scene. A small gray donkey came wandering into the clearing, attracted by the horses and the commotion. The animal was clearly a stray rib showing through dull coat, hooves in need of trimming, and an air of stubborn independence that suggested it had been taking care of itself for some time. The donkey walked directly to Little Dove and nuzzled her gently with its soft nose. Despite her pain and fear, the child smiled for the first time since her ordeal began. Rawlings saw an opportunity for additional humiliation. Well, would you look at that? Even the livestock knows its own kind. He dismounted and grabbed the donkey's rope halter. Boys, I think we found the perfect mount for our Apache friend here. The other men laughed as they understood Rawlings' plan. Instead of a horse befitting a warrior, they would force Taza to ride the pathetic donkey, a deliberate insult that would strip away his dignity in front of both his people and the townspeople. You want to come peaceful like to see Mr. Morrison? Rawlings said. Fine, but you'll do it proper Apache style on this here burro. Taza looked at the small donkey, then at the suffering family, then at Sarah, who still held the rifle with trembling but determined hands. The calculation was simple. His pride meant nothing compared to Little Dove's life. I accept, he said. The next hour passed like a nightmare that moved in slow motion. Sarah was forced to lower the rifle when more of Morrison's men arrived, alerted by the delay. The Apache family was released, but warned that they had 24 hours to be completely gone from the territory. Little Dove's burns were hastily bandaged with strips torn from Sarah's petticoat. Then came the moment that would be burned into the memory of everyone present. Taza approached the small donkey, placed his weathered hand gently on its back, and spoke to it in Apache. The donkey's ears pricked forward as if it understood, and for a moment there was complete silence in the clearing. I will call you Wisdom, Taza said in English, for you teach me that strength comes in unexpected forms. As he prepared to mount the donkey, Sarah stepped close to him. In her hand was her mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band that she had carried but never worn since her mother's death 5 years earlier. Take this, she whispered, pressing the ring into his palm, as a token that someone in this place believes in your peaceful intentions. Taza looked down at the ring, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. A white woman's wedding ring was not just jewelry. It was a symbol of sacred promises, family honor, and cultural identity. For her to give it to an Apache was an act of trust that could destroy her standing in the community. I cannot accept such a precious thing, he said quietly. You can, and you will, Sarah replied firmly, because I need you to come back. These people need you to come back, and that ring will remind you that someone is waiting. Taza closed his hand around the ring and slipped it into his medicine pouch alongside his grandfather's sacred herbs. Then he mounted the donkey with as much dignity as if he were climbing onto the finest warhorse in all the Apache nation. The donkey, despite its small size and poor condition, seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment. It stood perfectly, still as Taza settled onto its back, then began walking toward town with a steady, measured pace that spoke of wisdom rather than weakness. As the strange procession moved toward Copper Ridge Morrison's armed men, a giant Apache warrior on a tiny donkey, and a schoolteacher on horseback who had risked everything for strangers, Sarah found herself thinking about the ring she had given away. It had been her mother's dying wish that Sarah would find a man worthy of that ring and the love it represented. Looking at Taza's straight back and proud bearing as he rode the donkey without shame, Sarah realized she might have finally found him. But ahead of them lay Harrison Morrison's ranch, and whatever justice a powerful white man might decide to dispense to an Apache who dared to seek peace in a world that seemed determined to choose war. The meeting with Harrison Morrison took place. In the main room of his adobe ranch house, beneath oil paintings of European hunting scenes that seemed wildly out of place in the Arizona desert, Morrison sat behind an enormous oak desk imported from Chicago, while Taza stood with quiet dignity beside the small donkey that had become his unexpected companion. "So," Morrison said, pouring himself a glass of Kentucky bourbon, "you're the Apache who thinks he can waltz into civilized territory and make himself at home. I seek only to live peacefully on the land where my fathers are buried," Taza replied. "I have harmed no one and taken nothing that was not freely given." Morrison's laugh held no warmth. "Freely given? Boy, the only thing your people were ever given freely was a chance to surrender. Everything else you took by force until civilized. Men took it back." "Perhaps we remember different histories," Taza said carefully. For the next hour, Morrison lectured Taza about progress, civilization, and the inevitable march of white settlement. He spoke of territorial legislation, federal Indian policy, and his own role in bringing order to the frontier. But beneath the political rhetoric, his message was simple. There was no place in his vision of the future for free Apache. "However," Morrison concluded, "I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand that you somehow charmed some of our more naive citizens with your peaceful talk. So I'm prepared to make you an offer." He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew an official-looking document. "Here's a pass that will allow you safe passage to the San Carlos Reservation. It's signed by the territorial Indian agent and guaranteed to get you there without interference from federal troops. All you have to do is sign it and ride out of here." Taza studied the document carefully. It was legitimate, professionally printed, and would indeed guarantee his safe passage to the reservation where most of his people now lived in government custody. It was also a trap disguised as generosity. "And if I refuse?" Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then I'm afraid I can't guarantee your safety in this territory. There are a lot of rough men around here who don't share my civilized sensibilities when it comes to dealing with hostile Indians." The threat was clear, but Taza had faced worse odds than Morrison's hired guns. What concerned him more was what acceptance would mean. If he took the pass and left for San Carlos, it would confirm Morrison's narrative that Apache could not live peacefully among white settlers. It would abandon any hope of building understanding between the peoples. "I require time to consider your generous offer," Taza said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But remember, my patience, like my generosity, has limits." As Taza prepared to leave, Morrison made one final gesture that revealed his true character. He walked outside to where the donkey waited and pulled an apple from his pocket. "Here, you go, little fellow," Morrison said loudly, feeding the apple to the donkey while his ranch hands watched. "At least one of you knows his proper place." The insult was deliberate and public, designed to humiliate Taza in front of witnesses. But as Taza mounted the donkey and began the ride back to town, something unexpected happened. The small animal, perhaps sensing its rider's mood, or perhaps simply displaying the stubborn pride common to its kind, refused to take the direct path. Instead, the donkey led Taza on a winding route that took them past a section of Morrison's grazing land where cattle stood listlessly in the afternoon heat. As they rode closer, Taza noticed something that Morrison's men had apparently missed. The cattle were showing signs of sickness. Dismounting from the donkey, Taza approached the nearest animal and examined it with the practiced eye of someone who had learned livestock care from Apache elders. The symptoms were unmistakable. Alkaloid poisoning from drinking water contaminated by certain desert plants. The donkey had somehow led him to discover a problem that could cost Morrison hundreds of head of cattle if not addressed quickly. More importantly, it was a problem that Taza knew how to solve using traditional Apache knowledge of desert plant remedies. For a long moment, Taza stood among the sick cattle and weighed his options. He could ride away and let Morrison discover the problem on his own, if he discovered it at all, before losing significant livestock. It would be a form of poetic justice, given Morrison's treatment of the Apache family and his threats. But as he looked into the liquid brown eyes of a suffering cow, Taza heard his grandfather's voice speaking from memory. A healer serves all living things, not just his own people. The medicine spirits judge us by how we treat those who cannot repay our kindness. Making his decision, Taza mounted the donkey and rode hard back to Morrison's ranch house. He found Morrison on the front porch, sharing drinks and conversation with several of his foremen. "I must speak with you about your cattle," Taza said without preamble. Morrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. "My cattle? What about them?" "They are sick. Without treatment, you will lose many." The rancher's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion. "How do you know about my cattle?" "I saw them on my way back to town. The signs are clear to one who knows how to read them." Morrison studied Taza's face, looking for signs of deception or mockery. "And I suppose you just happen to know how to cure whatever's wrong with them." "Yes." "For a price?" "No doubt." Taza shook his head. "No price. Sick animals suffer needlessly. That is reason enough." For the first time since their meeting began, Morrison seemed genuinely puzzled by the Apache warrior. The offer made no strategic sense, provided no obvious advantage, and came from someone who had every reason to wish Morrison harm. "Jake," Morrison called to his foreman, "ride out and check the north pasture. See if there's anything wrong with the herd out there." While they waited for Rawlings to return, Morrison poured himself another bourbon and studied Taza with new interest. "Tell me something, Apache. Why would you help a man who's made it clear he wants you gone?" "Because the cattle did not choose to be caught between us," Taza replied, "and because healing is what healers do." An hour later, Rawlings returned with confirmation that nearly a third of the cattle in the north pasture were showing signs of illness. Morrison's expression grew grim as he calculated the potential financial loss. "All right," he said to Taza. "What needs to be done?" What followed was unlike anything the ranch hands had ever seen. Taza led them to specific plants growing along the creek that fed the north pasture plants that looked harmless but contained toxins that concentrated in standing water during the dry season. Working alongside the donkey, which seemed to possess an uncanny ability to locate the problem plants, Taza directed the men in clearing the contaminated vegetation. Then he prepared a remedy from other desert plants, explaining as he worked how Apache healers had been treating alkaloid poisoning in livestock for generations. The mixture had to be prepared precisely, with specific proportions and timing, using knowledge that had been passed down through oral tradition for centuries. As the sun set over the desert, Taza and Morrison's men worked together to administer the medicine to the affected cattle. The donkey proved invaluable in herding the sick animals and somehow keeping them calm during treatment. What should have been a chaotic and difficult process became almost peaceful under the little animal's influence. By the time they finished, even Morrison's most hardened ranch hands were looking at Taza with something approaching respect. He had worked beside them without complaint, shared knowledge that could save their employer thousands of dollars, and asked for nothing in return. Morrison himself watched the proceedings from horseback, his calculating mind trying to reconcile this display of genuine healing with his preconceptions about Apache warriors. When Taza finally approached him to report the work completed, Morrison's usual arrogance seemed tempered by genuine puzzlement. "Why?" Morrison asked simply. "Because tomorrow the sun will rise on both our peoples," Taza replied. "We can greet it as enemies who diminish each other, or as neighbors who make each other stronger." As Taza mounted the donkey and prepared to return to town, Morrison called out one final time. "Apache, this doesn't change anything between us. I still want you gone from this territory." Taza turned in the saddle, and for the first time, Morrison saw him smile. Perhaps not yet, Mr. Morrison, but seeds take time to grow. The ride back to Copper Ridge was peaceful in the gathering darkness. The donkey seemed to know its way even in the dim starlight, picking a careful path between cactus and stone. As they traveled, Taza found himself reflecting on the day's events and the sacred stones he carried in his medicine pouch. His grandfather had given him those stones during his vision quest, explaining that they held the power to heal not just bodies, but relationships between people who had forgotten their common humanity. Today, those stones had guided him to help even an enemy, and in doing so, had planted seeds of doubt in Morrison's certainty about Apache nature. The donkey suddenly stopped and turned its head toward a sound that Taza's ears had missed. Moments later, he heard it too, the soft crying of a child somewhere in the darkness ahead. Following the sound, they found Little Dove sitting alone beside a small fire, her burns still bandaged but her family nowhere in sight. When she saw Taza approaching on the donkey, relief flooded her young face. "Grandfather and grandmother went to gather medicine plants," she said in Apache. "They told me to wait, but I was afraid." Taza dismounted and knelt beside the child, checking her bandages and offering water from his canteen. The burns were healing cleanly, but he could see the deeper wounds that cruelty had left on her spirit. "Would you like to meet my friend?" he asked, gesturing toward the donkey. "His name is Wisdom, and he has spent the day teaching stubborn cattle to accept medicine." For the first time since her ordeal, Little Dove giggled. She approached the donkey cautiously, then broke into delighted laughter when the animal gently nuzzled her cheek. When Joseph Standing Bear and his daughter Mary returned an hour later, they found Little Dove riding the donkey around the campfire while Taza walked beside them, telling stories of the donkey's intelligence and courage. The sight of their daughters' joy brought tears to the adults' eyes. "The white men said we must leave," Joseph told Taza quietly. "But where can we go? This is all we know." Taza was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on the donkey's neck as he considered his words. "Perhaps there is another way," he said finally. "But it will require courage from all of us and patience beyond measure." As he shared his growing plan with the family, the donkey stood quietly in the firelight, its intelligent eyes seeming to understand that it had become part of something larger than anyone had imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in the glow of a small campfire, hope was being born from the unlikely friendship between a warrior, a donkey, and people who refused to let fear extinguish their faith in healing. The news of Morrison's cattle recovery spread through Copper Ridge faster than wildfire. By the time Taza returned to town the next morning, leading the donkey that had somehow become his constant companion, a small crowd had gathered outside Murphy's General store to witness what many were calling a miracle. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town's physician, was among those waiting. A dignified man in his 60s with silver whiskers and intelligent eyes. Dr. Hartwell had been struggling for months to treat a mysterious ailment affecting several of the town's children. When he heard about Taza's veterinary success, his scientific curiosity overcame his cultural prejudices. "Mr. Taza," Dr. Hartwell said, approaching with professional courtesy, "I wonder if I might have a word with you about medicinal plants." The request surprised everyone within earshot, including Taza himself. White doctors rarely acknowledged that Apache healing methods had any validity, preferring to dismiss them as primitive superstition. "You wish to learn Apache medicine?" Taza asked carefully. "I wish to learn anything that might help my patients," Dr. Hartwell replied. 3 children in this town have been suffering from a condition I cannot identify, much less treat. If traditional knowledge might provide insight, I would be foolish to ignore it out of pride. The conversation that followed took place in Dr. Hartwell's small office, with the donkey waiting patiently outside in the shade of the building's overhang. Taza listened carefully as the doctor described the children's symptoms: persistent cough, fever that came and went, and a peculiar rash that appeared on their arms and chest. "Have you examined what the children eat and drink?" Taza asked. "Sometimes sickness comes not from spirits of illness, but from what we put into our bodies." Dr. Hartwell frowned thoughtfully. "The symptoms don't match any common poisoning I'm familiar with. But I confess, my knowledge of local plants is limited to what I learned in medical school back east." "Show me where these children spend their days," Taza said. "The land often speaks louder than symptoms." What followed was an extraordinary collaboration. Dr. Hartwell, Taza, and even the donkey, who seemed to possess an uncanny ability to detect subtle scents, visited the homes and play areas of the affected children. Within an hour, Taza had identified the problem, a decorative plant that one of the families had imported from California and planted in their garden. The plant was beautiful but toxic, and the children had been exposed through handling its leaves during play. "Jimson weed," Dr. Hartwell said, examining the plant through his magnifying glass. "I should have recognized it, but it looks different in this climate than in my botany texts." "My grandmother called it the plant that confuses," Taza said. "Small amounts cause the symptoms you described. Larger amounts bring visions or death." Working together, they prepared a treatment using activated charcoal from specific desert woods, combined with teas brewed from plants. That would help the children's bodies eliminate the toxins. Dr. Hartwell was amazed by the precision of Apache pharmacology knowledge that had been refined over centuries of careful observation and experimentation. "This is remarkable," the doctor said as they prepared the medicines. "Your people have been practicing what we might call clinical botany for generations." "We have been listening to the plant's teachings," Taza replied. "They are patient teachers for those willing to learn." The success of the treatment created ripples throughout the community. Parents who had been suspicious of the Apache warrior began to see him in a different light when their children recovered completely within days. Sarah McKenna made a point of visiting each family to ensure they understood that Taza's intervention had been crucial to the cure. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source: the children themselves. Little Tommy Henderson, the blacksmith's son, had been the sickest of the three. When he was fully recovered, he approached Taza outside Murphy's store with the solemn dignity that only a 7-year-old could muster. "Mr. Taza," Tommy said, "my ma says you made me well when I was real sick." "Dr. Hartwell made you well," Taza replied. "I only helped him listen to what the plants were saying. Could you teach me to listen to plants too?" The question, asked with such innocent sincerity, seemed to hang in the desert air. Every adult within earshot held their breath, recognizing that Taza's answer would set a precedent that could change the town's future. "Plants are good teachers," Taza said carefully, "but learning their language requires patience and respect. Are you willing to be patient?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "I'm real patient. Ask my pa. I can sit still for almost a whole hour when I'm fishing." The laughter that followed broke much of the remaining tension. Over the following weeks, Tommy became Taza's most devoted student, following the warrior and his donkey on their daily rounds and asking endless questions about plants, animals, and the desert ecosystem. But not everyone was pleased by these developments. Harrison Morrison watched the growing acceptance of Taza with increasing alarm. The Apache's integration into the community threatened everything. Morrison had worked to achieve a territory cleansed of Indian influence and open to unrestricted white settlement. Morrison's response was swift and calculated. He began spreading rumors that Taza was gathering intelligence for a larger Apache war party, that his medical knowledge was actually a form of witchcraft, and that his presence was attracting hostile Indians to the area. When rumors alone proved insufficient, he escalated to more direct methods. The attack came at dawn, 3 weeks after the healing of Dr. Hartwell's patients. Taza was camped in his usual spot by the cottonwoods when riders surrounded his position. But these weren't Morrison's usual ranch hands. They were strangers, hard men with the look of professional killers about them. "You the Apache they call Taza?" the leader asked. He was a thin man with pale eyes and scars on his gun hand that spoke of many violent encounters. "I am Taza," the warrior replied calmly, though his hand moved subtly toward his father's wrapped lance. "Nothing personal, but you've become inconvenient to certain interests. Time for you to move along permanent-like." The donkey, sensing danger, moved closer to Taza and planted itself between the warrior and the gunman. The little animal's ears were laid back, and its eyes showed a fierce protectiveness that seemed almost human in its intensity. "I mean no harm to anyone," Taza said. "I seek only to live in peace." "Peace is expensive," the gunman replied, drawing his pistol, "and some folks can't afford what you're selling." What happened next would be talked about in Copper Ridge for decades to come. As the gunman raised his weapon, the donkey suddenly reared up on its hind legs and let out a bray, so loud and piercing that it startled the gunman's horses into rearing and bucking. In the confusion that followed, Taza rolled behind a fallen log and unwrapped his father's lance. But the old weapon remained unused. Instead of fighting, Taza did something that confounded everyone present. He began to sing. It was an Apache healing song, ancient and powerful, that his grandfather had taught him to calm frightened animals and bring peace to troubled spirits. The effect was extraordinary. The horses stopped their panicking. The gunmen found themselves reluctant to fire, and an otherworldly calm settled over the clearing. Even the donkey ceased its aggressive posturing and stood quietly, as if listening to music that spoke to its soul. "What kind of witchcraft is this?" one of the gunmen muttered. "No witchcraft," Taza replied, still singing softly. "Only the recognition that we are all connected, man, animal, and the earth that holds us." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by the arrival of an unexpected rescue party. Sarah McKenna rode into the clearing, followed by Dr. Hartwell, Thomas Murphy, and a half-dozen townspeople who had noticed the strangers riding toward Taza's camp before dawn. "Gentlemen," Dr. Hartwell said with quiet authority, "I believe you're on the wrong side of a misunderstanding." The lead gunman found himself facing not just an Apache warrior, but a significant portion of Copper Ridge's most respected citizens. His calculation of risk and reward shifted rapidly. "This ain't over," he said to Taza as his men holstered their weapons. "Some people don't take kindly to disruption of their plans." After the gunman rode away, Sarah approached Taza with obvious concern. "Are you hurt?" "No harm came to me," Taza replied, but his eyes were sad. "Though I fear my presence brings danger to those who show me kindness." "Then you underestimate the people of this town," Dr. Hartwell said firmly. "We don't abandon friends because of threats from strangers." As the rescue party prepared to return to town, Tommy Henderson's father, the blacksmith, lingered behind. Jim Henderson was a man of few words and strong opinions, and his acceptance of Taza had been slower than most. "Apache," Henderson said, gruffly, "my boy thinks considerable of you. Says you're teaching him to read the desert like a book." "Your son has the gift of listening," Taza replied. "It is a rare thing." Henderson nodded slowly. "Reckon a man who'd risk his life to heal sick children and cure dying cattle might be worth having around, regardless of what color skin he was born with." The simple declaration, coming from one of the town's most practical and skeptical residents, marked a turning point. But as Taza mounted the donkey for the ride back to his camp, he touched the broken arrow hidden in his medicine pouch, a reminder that his hopes for immediate reconciliation had been shattered by the morning's violence. The path to peace, he realized, would be longer and more dangerous than he had imagined. But as the donkey carried him steadily forward, its sure-footed determination seemed to promise that patient persistence could overcome even the deepest prejudices. The flash flood came without warning, as they always did in the desert. One moment the arroyo was bone dry under the scorching afternoon sun. The next, it was a churning torrent of red water and debris that could sweep a horse and rider to their death in seconds. Morrison's men had been driving a herd of cattle toward the railroad depot in Tucson when the storm struck the mountains 20 miles away. They had no way of knowing that the distant thunder meant death was racing toward them at 30 miles per hour in the form of a 10-foot wall of water. Taza heard the roar first, sound like a locomotive approaching at full speed where no railroad existed. He and the donkey were gathering medicinal plants in the higher ground above the arroyo when the sound reached them. Without hesitation, he mounted the donkey and rode hard toward the danger, knowing that someone was about to need help. Desperately, he arrived at the rim of the arroyo just as the flood hit Morrison's cattle drive. The scene below was chaos. Cattle bawling in terror as they were swept downstream, horses rearing and plunging as their riders fought to reach higher ground, and men shouting orders that couldn't be heard above the roar of the water. 3 of Morrison's men were trapped on a small island of rock in the middle of the torrent, their horses lost and the water rising around them with every passing minute. Among them was Jake Rawlings, the foreman who had tormented the Apache family weeks earlier. Any rational person would have ridden away. These were the same men who had participated in the burning and torture of Apache families, who had mocked and threatened Taza at every opportunity. Rawlings himself had been the architect of the donkey humiliation and had made it clear that he would kill Taza given the slightest provocation. But as Taza watched the men struggling against the flood, he heard his grandmother's voice speaking. From memory, the eagle feather teaches us that we rise above our enemies not by destroying them, but by lifting them up. He touched the eagle feather hair ornament hidden in his medicine pouch, a sacred piece that had belonged to his grandmother and represented the feminine wisdom of peace over the masculine impulse toward war. The feather had been blessed in ceremony and was said to carry the power to transform enemies into allies through acts of unexpected grace. "Can you swim in fast water?" Taza asked the donkey, knowing the question was absurd, but somehow needing to voice it. The donkey's response was to pick its way carefully down the steep bank toward the flood, as if it understood exactly what was needed. What followed was one of the most remarkable rescues in Arizona Territory history. Using skills learned from a lifetime of navigating desert waters, Taza guided the donkey into the torrent at precisely the right angle to reach the stranded men. The small animal proved to be an extraordinary swimmer, its compact body and powerful legs perfectly suited for fighting the current. "Take my hand," Taza shouted to the nearest man, a young cowboy who couldn't have been more than 20. "I ain't touching no Apache," the young man shouted back, even as the water rose to his chest. "Then you will die," Taza replied without emotion. "Choose." Fear proved stronger than prejudice. The young cowboy grabbed Taza's outstretched hand and allowed himself to be pulled onto the donkey's back. Together, they fought their way to the safety of the opposite bank, where other survivors were gathering. Twice more Taza and the donkey plunged into the raging water. The second rescue brought out a middle-aged ranch hand who had been injured when his horse fell. The man was barely conscious and unable to help himself, requiring Taza to hold him steady while the donkey battled the current. But it was the third rescue that would change everything. Jake Rawlings, the man who had branded a child and threatened Taza's life, stood alone on the shrinking rock island as the water continued to rise. He was trapped, terrified, and facing certain death when Taza and the donkey approached for the final time. "Why?" Rawlings shouted as he climbed onto the donkey behind Taza. "After everything I've done to you and your people, why would you save me?" Taza was quiet for a long moment as the donkey struggled against the current, carrying them towards safety. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible above the roar of the water. "Because my grandmother's spirit is watching, and she would be ashamed if I let hatred make me smaller than I was born to be." They reached the bank just as the rock island disappeared completely beneath the flood. Rawlings slumped to the ground, exhausted and shaking, while the donkey stood calmly. Despite having just performed what amounted to 3 separate miracles, the other survivors gathered around in stunned silence. They had witnessed an Apache warrior risk his life repeatedly to save men who had shown him nothing but cruelty and contempt. It was an act of heroism that transcended all their assumptions about race, culture, and human nature. Jesus Christ. "Apache," one of the men finally said, "you saved our lives." "The water would have taken you," Taza replied simply. "That would have served no one." When Harrison Morrison arrived an hour later with a rescue party, he found his men alive and telling a story that challenged everything he believed about Apache character. Jake Rawlings, in particular, seemed transformed by the experience. The arrogant foreman had been replaced by a man struggling to understand how his worldview could have been so completely wrong. Morrison listened to the accounts with a carefully neutral expression, but those who knew him well could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Taza's heroism was creating exactly the kind of narrative that Morrison had been working to prevent a story of Apache nobility that might inspire sympathy and support for peaceful coexistence. "Well," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying just enough skepticism to plant doubt, "I suppose we should be grateful that Mr. Taza happened to be in the right place at the right time." The implication was subtle but clear. Perhaps the rescue had been too convenient, too perfectly timed to be entirely coincidental. Maybe the Apache had known about the flood in advance, or even had something to do with causing it. But Morrison's attempted manipulation backfired. Jake Rawlings, still dripping with floodwater and shaking from exhaustion, turned on his employer with unexpected fury. "Mr. Morrison," Rawlings said, his voice hoarse but determined, "that man risked his life 3 times to save us. There weren't nothing convenient about it, and there sure as hell weren't nothing suspicious. He could have watched us drown, and nobody would have blamed him, considering how we've treated him." The other rescued men nodded in agreement, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude and shame. They had been forced to confront the reality that their prejudices had nearly cost them their lives, and that salvation had come from the very person they had been taught to fear. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he was too skilled a politician to argue with flood survivors in front of witnesses. Instead, he made a show of thanking Taza publicly while privately calculating how to minimize the damage to his campaign against Apache presence in the territory. "Mr. Taza," Morrison said with forced graciousness, "it seems the territory owes you a debt of gratitude. Perhaps we should discuss ways to properly recognize your heroism." Taza studied Morrison's face, reading the insincerity behind the diplomatic words. "No recognition is needed," he said quietly. "I did what any person should do when others are in danger." "Modest as well as brave," Morrison replied. "Admirable qualities in any man." As the rescue party prepared to return to town, Dr. Hartwell approached Taza with a proposal that would have far-reaching consequences. "Mr. Taza," the doctor said, "I've been thinking about our collaboration with the plant medicine. The Territorial Medical Board is holding its annual conference in Phoenix next month, and I would like to present a paper on traditional healing methods. Would you consider accompanying me as a collaborator?" The request was extraordinary. A white doctor was asking an Apache to appear before a gathering of territorial medical professionals as an equal partner in scientific research. It represented the kind of recognition and respect that no Apache had received in official territorial circles. "You would present Apache knowledge to white doctors?" Taza asked. "I would present our shared discoveries," Dr. Hartwell corrected. "The knowledge belongs to your people, but the research we've done together belongs to both of us." Before Taza could respond, Morrison interjected with smoothly disguised concern. "Dr. Hartwell, while I admire your scientific enthusiasm, I wonder, if you've considered the political implications. The medical board includes several territorial legislators who might not appreciate such an unconventional presentation. It was a subtle threat wrapped in friendly advice, but Dr. Hartwell was not easily intimidated. Mr. Morrison, I believe good medicine transcends politics. If our legislators can't appreciate healing knowledge, perhaps they're in the wrong line of work. The tension between Morrison and Dr. Hartwell was palpable, representing a larger conflict between those who saw Taza's integration as positive and those who viewed it as a threat to established order. Standing between them, with his hand resting on the donkey's neck, Taza found himself at the center of a battle for the soul of the community. "I will consider Dr. Hartwell's invitation," Taza said diplomatically. "But first, there are people closer to home who need healing." As if summoned by his words, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching at a desperate gallop. It was Mary, Standing Bear, the daughter of the Apache elder, and her face showed the kind of panic that could only mean life or death emergency. "Taza," she called out as she reached the group, "please come quickly. My father has been bitten by a sidewinder, and the white doctor's medicine is not working. He is dying, and you are our only hope." The request created an immediate crisis. Joseph Standing Bear was not just any Apache. He was one of the last traditional healers among his people and a living repository of ancient knowledge. His death would be a cultural catastrophe for the scattered Apache families still in the territory. But treating him would require Taza to use the most powerful and sacred aspects of Apache medicine, rituals that had never been shared with white observers. More importantly, it would require him to leave the relative safety of Copper Ridge and travel to the hidden camp where the Apache families were living in violation of territorial law. "Go," Dr. Hartwell said immediately. "I'll provide whatever supplies you need from my medical bag." "Dr. Hartwell," Morrison said warningly, "you're talking about aiding and abetting illegal residents." "I'm talking about saving a man's life," the doctor replied firmly. "If that's illegal, then the law is wrong." As Taza prepared to leave with Mary Standing Bear, he looked back at the group of men he had just rescued from the flood. Their faces showed a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude, confusion, and the dawning realization that their simple worldview had been shattered by an act of selfless courage. "Thank you," Jake Rawlings said quietly, "for everything." Taza nodded once, then mounted the donkey and followed Mary toward the hidden camp where an old man's life hung in the balance. Behind him, he left a community wrestling with questions that had no easy answers, and a cattle baron whose carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble in the face of inconvenient truths. The hidden Apache camp lay in a box canyon that had sheltered Taza's people for generations. Sacred springs fed pools of clear water, and ancient petroglyphs covered the red rock walls like prayers written in stone. It was here that the families driven from their legal lands had taken refuge, living quietly and hoping to avoid the attention of federal authorities. Joseph Standing Bear lay on a blanket beside one of the sacred pools, his breath shallow and his skin gray with the pallor of approaching death. The sidewinder's venom was winning its race through his bloodstream, and conventional medicine had proven useless against the desert serpent's ancient poison. Taza dismounted from the donkey and knelt beside the old man, placing his weathered hand on Standing Bear's forehead. The fever was intense, and the characteristic swelling of rattlesnake envenomation had spread from the bite site on his ankle up his entire leg. "How long since the bite?" Taza asked Mary. 6 hours, she replied, tears streaming down her face. "We tried everything, the white doctor's medicines, the old remedies we remembered. Nothing works." Taza examined the wound carefully, noting the particular pattern of fang marks and discoloration. This was no ordinary rattlesnake bite. The sidewinder was one of the most venomous serpents in the desert, and its poison attacked both the blood and nervous system simultaneously. I need sacred plants, Taza said, rising and walking to his father's tomahawk, which he had placed reverently beside his other possessions. And I need the blessing of the ancestors. The tomahawk had been transformed over the years from a weapon of war into a tool for building and healing. Its steel head bore intricate engravings that told the story of Taza's lineage, while its wooden handle had been blessed by 3 generations of Apache medicine men. Today, it would serve as both practical tool and spiritual focus for the most demanding healing ceremony of Taza's life. Working with swift precision, Taza used the tomahawk to gather specific plants from the canyon walls roots that grew only in sacred ground, leaves that had been touched by morning prayers, and bark from trees that had witnessed centuries of Apache ceremonies. The donkey followed close behind, somehow understanding the solemnity of the moment and the importance of its companion's work. The preparation of the medicine required not just botanical knowledge, but spiritual preparation as well. Taza purified himself in the sacred springs, sang the healing songs his grandfather had taught him, and called upon the spirits of all the healers who had walked before him. "What is he doing?" asked Little Dove, who had been staying at the camp with her grandparents. "He is asking the plant spirits to give their strongest medicine," Mary explained. "And he is offering to take some of Grandfather's pain into himself, so that Grandfather might live." The little girl watched with wide eyes as Taza worked through the night, mixing compounds with the precision of a chemist and the reverence of a priest. The donkey remained close throughout the vigil, occasionally nudging Taza gently when he needed to rest or drink water. As dawn broke over the canyon walls, Taza completed the medicine and approached Standing Bear with a bowl containing a bitter-smelling liquid that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Drink, Grandfather," Taza said gently, supporting the old man's head. "The plant spirits have agreed to fight the serpent's poison, but you must help them by choosing to live." Standing Bear's eyes fluttered open as he swallowed the medicine. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, color began to return to his face, and his breathing became stronger and more regular. "The spirits are powerful today," Standing Bear whispered, managing a weak smile. "Or perhaps they are simply fond of stubborn old men who refuse to die quietly." The transformation was remarkable, but gradual. Over the next several hours, the swelling in Standing Bear's leg began to subside. His fever broke, and his strength slowly returned. By midday, he was sitting up and taking small amounts of food. "You have saved my father's life," Mary said to Taza, her voice thick with emotion. "Our people will remember this gift for all generations." But Taza's thoughts were troubled as he cleaned and blessed his father's tomahawk before wrapping it again in red cloth. The healing had required him to use knowledge that was considered sacred and secret medicine that Apache tradition said should never be shared with outsiders. Yet he knew that Dr. Hartwell and others would want to understand how such a remarkable cure had been achieved. "What troubles you, nephew?" Standing Bear asked, using the honorific term that showed respect for Taza's spiritual accomplishments. "The White Doctor has been my partner in healing," Taza replied. "He will ask how this cure was accomplished. But these medicines are sacred to our people, not meant for sharing with outsiders." Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, his wise eyes studying the young man who had saved his life. "Perhaps," he said finally, "the spirits brought you this choice for a reason. Perhaps they want you to decide what is more important, keeping old secrets or saving new lives." Before Taza could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Mary and the other Apache families immediately tensed, preparing to flee deeper into the canyon's hidden recesses. But Taza recognized the voices calling out. In greeting, Dr. Hartwell rode into the camp, accompanied by Sarah McKenna and, surprisingly, Thomas Murphy. All three looked relieved to find the Apache family safe and settled. "We came as soon as we could gather supplies," Dr. Hartwell said, dismounting and approaching with his medical bag. How is the patient? See for yourself, Taza said, gesturing towards Standing Bear, who was now sitting upright and alert. Dr. Hartwell examined the old man with professional thoroughness, his amazement growing with each test. The wound site showed clear signs of healing. The patient's vital signs were strong, and there were no lingering effects from what should have been a fatal envenomation. This is extraordinary, the doctor said finally. I've never seen a recovery from sidewinder venom this complete or this rapid. What treatment did you use? Taza hesitated, feeling the weight of generations of tradition pulling against his desire to share healing knowledge that could save lives. It was Standing Bear who broke the silence. Doctor, the old man said in careful English, my nephew has used medicine that comes from our most sacred traditions. But I am old, and I have seen what happens when knowledge dies with those who carry it. Perhaps it is time for walls between healers to come down. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes bright with understanding. Mr. Taza, you're facing the same choice my students face every day in the classroom, whether to share knowledge that could help others, even when it means changing the way things have always been done. But if I share sacred medicine with outsiders, Taza said quietly, am I betraying my ancestors or honoring them? Thomas Murphy, who had remained silent until now, spoke up with the practical wisdom of a merchant. Seems to me, if your ancestors were healers, they'd want their knowledge used to heal folks, regardless of what color skin those folks happen to be born with. Dr. Hartwell approached Taza with the respect of one professional addressing another. I understand the difficulty of your decision. In my own medical training, we learned to guard certain techniques and knowledge, sharing them only with other doctors. But I've come to believe that healing knowledge belongs to everyone who needs it. The donkey, which had been grazing quietly nearby, suddenly approached and nuzzled Taza gently, as if offering encouragement. The gesture broke through the last of Taza's resistance. I will share what I can, he said finally. But some knowledge is too sacred to speak aloud. It must be learned through ceremony and earned through spiritual preparation. I understand, Dr. Hartwell replied. Perhaps we could begin with the botanical aspects, which plants were used and how they were prepared. The spiritual elements can remain with your people, as they should. What followed was an extraordinary collaboration. Standing Bear, despite his recent brush with death, insisted on participating as Taza demonstrated the preparation of anti-venom compounds using desert plants. Dr. Hartwell took careful notes while Sarah sketched the various plants and Murphy asked practical questions about where they could be found and harvested. This particular root, Taza explained, holding up a gnarled specimen, neutralizes the neurotoxins that attack the nervous system. But it must be gathered at dawn and prepared immediately, or it loses its potency. And this bark? Dr. Hartwell asked, examining another component. Strengthens the heart and helps the body fight the blood poisoning, Standing Bear replied. My grandfather's grandfather discovered its use during a vision quest. He fasted for 4 days until the plant spirits showed him their secrets. As the afternoon wore on, Little Dove joined the group, helping to identify plants and sharing stories her grandparents had told her about traditional medicines. Her presence served as a bridge between the adult world of serious medicine and the wonder that healing should inspire in the young. Will you teach me about plant spirits? She asked to Sarah, who had been particularly attentive to the child's comments. I think, Sarah replied, that we should all be learning from each other. Perhaps you could visit our school and teach the other children what you know about desert plants. The suggestion created a moment of electric possibility. An Apache child teaching white children, it was exactly the kind of cultural exchange that Morrison and his supporters were working to prevent. The territorial authorities would not approve, Taza said cautiously. The territorial authorities, Sarah replied with spirit, don't run my classroom." "I do." As evening approached, Dr. Hartwell prepared to leave with his notes and new knowledge about antivenom preparation. But before departing, he made an offer that surprised everyone. "Mr. Taza, Mr. Standing Bear, I would like to propose a formal partnership. What if we established a clinic here in Copper Ridge that combined the best of both our medical traditions? You could treat patients using Apache methods. I could provide conventional medicine, and together we might accomplish more than either could alone." The proposal was revolutionary. A joint practice between white and Apache healers would be unprecedented in the territory. It would also make Taza and the Apache families highly visible to federal authorities who were trying to force all remaining Apache onto reservations. "Such a partnership would bring danger," Taza said quietly. "There are those who profit from keeping our people separated and suspicious of each other." "Then we'll face that danger together," Dr. Hartwell replied. "Good medicine shouldn't have to hide in canyons." As the white visitors prepared to leave, Sarah lingered behind to speak privately with Taza. They walked together to the edge of the sacred pool, where the donkey was drinking peacefully in the gathering twilight. "I've been thinking about the ring I gave you," Sarah said quietly. "About what it means that I entrusted it to an Apache warrior instead of keeping it for the white husband my family expected me to find." Taza touched the medicine pouch where he kept the ring alongside his grandfather's sacred herbs. "It is a treasure beyond price. I guard it carefully." "It's not meant to be guarded," Sarah replied, her green eyes reflecting the last light of day. "It's meant to be given when the deepest right moment comes to the right person, as a symbol of promises worth keeping." The meaning of her words hung in the desert air between them, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. A relationship between an Apache warrior and a white school teacher would challenge every social convention of their time and place. There are those who would see such promises as betrayal of everything they believe, Taza said carefully. "Then perhaps," Sarah replied, "it's time for them to believe in something better." As she rode away with the others, Taza remained by the sacred pool with the donkey, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The day had brought healing and hope, but also new complexities that would test every relationship he had built in. Copper Ridge, Standing Bear approached and settled beside him on the rocks. "Change comes whether we welcome it or resist it," the old man said. "The question is whether we will help guide it toward wisdom or let it lead us toward chaos." Looking at his faithful donkey companion, Taza found himself thinking about the patient persistence that had brought them this far. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, under the ancient stars that had witnessed generations of Apache prayers, there was peace and the promise that healing could bridge any divide. The discovery that would change everything came from the most unlikely source, the donkey's stubborn refusal to follow a direct path back to town. 3 days after the healing ceremony in the hidden canyon, Taza was returning to Copper Ridge when his four-legged companion suddenly veered off the established trail and headed toward a cluster of rocks that seemed to hold no particular interest. "What troubles you, friend?" Taza asked, but the donkey was insistent, braying softly and pawing at the ground near what appeared to be a natural depression among the boulders. Trusting the animal's instincts, Taza dismounted and began examining the area more closely. What he found hidden beneath a thin layer of sand and debris made his blood run cold. A leather satchel wrapped in oiled cloth, buried hastily but recently. Inside the satchel were documents that would expose the most elaborate fraud in Arizona. Territory history. Land deeds bearing official territorial seals, but with dates and signatures that didn't match the aging of the paper. Survey maps that show boundaries completely different from what Morrison claimed. And most damning of all, correspondence between Morrison and territorial officials that revealed a systematic plan to falsify Apache land grants, making legal residents appear to be TRES Taza spread the documents carefully on a flat rock, his warrior's training allowing him to quickly assess their significance. Morrison's forged deed was at the center of everything, a masterfully crafted document that claimed ownership of nearly 50,000 acres, including the sacred canyon where the Apache families were now hiding and the very land where Copper Ridge itself had been built. "You clever creature," Taza murmured to the donkey, who seemed pleased with itself for the discovery. "You have found the truth that explains everything." As Taza studied the papers more carefully, the full scope of Morrison's deception became clear. The cattle baron hadn't simply been trying to drive Apache families from their legal lands. He had been systematically stealing territory from both Apache and white settlers using falsified documents and corrupt territorial officials. The donkey gift that had seemed like cruel mockery was revealed as part of Morrison's larger strategy. By publicly humiliating Taza and presenting him as a typical defeated Apache, Morrison had hoped to discourage any territorial investigation into Apache land claims. A proud warrior mounted on a donkey would be seen as pathetic rather than legitimate someone whose complaints could be safely ignored. But the documents revealed an even more sinister truth. Morrison had been selling weapons to Apache bands still fighting in Mexico, using the profits to bribe territorial officials and finance his land acquisitions. The very violence he publicly condemned, he had been secretly encouraging for his own profit. Among the papers was a letter that made Taza's hands tremble with rage. "The Apache problem will resolve itself once we eliminate their most dangerous element, those who seek peace rather than war. A hostile Apache can be fought and defeated, but a peaceful Apache who gains white allies threatens our entire enterprise. The warrior called Taza must be removed before he inspires others to believe coexistence is possible." Morrison hadn't just wanted Taza gone. He had seen the Apache's peaceful approach as the greatest threat to his criminal enterprise. Every act of healing, every moment of cooperation between cultures, undermined the narrative of inevitable conflict that justified Morrison's actions. The federal agents that Taza had assumed were legitimate law enforcement were revealed in the correspondence to be Morrison's paid allies, men who carried authentic badges but reported directly to the cattle baron rather than the territorial authorities. The system was corrupt from top to bottom, and Morrison was its architect. As Taza carefully rewrapped the documents, his mind raced through the implications. These papers could expose Morrison's crimes and restore legal land rights to dozens of families, both Apache and white. But they would also make Taza a target for elimination, and anyone who supported him would face Morrison's wrath. The donkey seemed to sense his companion's inner turmoil and nuzzled him gently, as if offering comfort and encouragement. Looking into the animal's intelligent eyes, Taza made his decision. "We ride to town, my friend. It is time for truth to see daylight." The journey back to Copper Ridge gave Taza time to plan his next moves carefully. Simply presenting the documents wouldn't be enough. Morrison's influence ran too deep, and he had too many allies in positions of authority. The truth would have to be revealed in a way that made denial impossible and cover-up impractical. Sarah McKenna was teaching her afternoon arithmetic lesson when Taza appeared at the schoolhouse door, the donkey waiting patiently outside. The children's faces lit up with excitement. They had come to love the gentle Apache warrior who told stories about desert animals and treated even the smallest child with respect. "Mr. Taza," little Tommy Henderson called out, "did you bring wisdom today? Can we see him after school?" "Perhaps later," Taza replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But first, I must speak with Miss McKenna about something very important." Sarah recognized the gravity in his expression and quickly assigned the children independent work before stepping outside with Taza. When he showed her the documents, Her face went white with shock and then red with anger. "This explains everything," she said, studying Morrison's forged deed. "The sudden pressure to stop teaching Apache children, the questions about my lesson plans, the hints that my contract might not be renewed. He's been working to eliminate anyone who might document his crimes." "There is more," Taza said quietly, showing her the letter about his elimination. "Morrison sees peaceful coexistence as his greatest enemy. Every friendship between our peoples threatens his plans." Sarah's hand shook as she read the letter. "He's planning to have you killed." "He has already tried twice," Taza replied. "The gunmen who came to my camp were his, though he was careful not to leave evidence of his involvement." "We have to expose this immediately," Sarah said. "Dr. Hartwell needs to see these documents, and Thomas Murphy, and everyone else who's been supporting you." But Taza shook his head. "Morrison has allies among the territorial authorities. Simply sharing these papers could result in their disappearance and our deaths. We must be more careful." That evening, a secret meeting convened in the back room of Murphy's General Store. Dr. Hartwell, Thomas Murphy, Jim Henderson the blacksmith, and several other townspeople gathered to examine Morrison's documents and plan their response. "Sweet Jesus," Murphy whispered as he studied the correspondence. "He's been robbing us all blind. Look at this. My store's land deed shows one boundary, but Morrison's survey shows him owning half my lot." "Same here," Henderson added grimly. "According to these papers, he claims ownership of my smithy and my house. We've all been living on stolen land without knowing it." Dr. Hartwell examined the documents with the methodical precision of a trained scientist. "These forgeries are sophisticated, but not perfect. Look at this signature. It's supposed to be from Territorial Governor Safford, but Safford wasn't in office when this document was supposedly signed. The question is," Sarah said, "how do we expose this without getting ourselves killed in the process? Morrison has shown he's willing to use violence to protect his interests." It was Taza who provided the answer, drawing on warrior wisdom about defeating superior forces through cunning rather than direct confrontation. "We create a situation where Morrison must reveal his true nature in front of witnesses he cannot control or eliminate," he said. "We force him to choose between losing his stolen empire or exposing himself as a criminal." "The town meeting," Murphy said suddenly. "There's a territorial representative coming next week to discuss statehood preparations. Morrison will be there, along with dozens of people from surrounding settlements. If we could present this evidence, then he'll deny everything," Henderson interrupted. "Say the documents are Apache forgeries designed to cause trouble." "Not if we present them properly," Sarah said, her teacher's mind working through the problem. "What if we don't accuse Morrison directly? What if we simply ask for clarification about conflicting land records and let the evidence speak for itself?" Taza nodded slowly. "And what if we ensure that the Apache families are present to tell their own stories? Morrison has spread lies about hostile Indians threatening the settlement. Let people see Standing Bear and Little Dove and judge for themselves what kind of threat they represent." The plan that emerged was risky but elegant. They would use the public forum of the town meeting to present evidence of document forgery without directly accusing Morrison. They would bring the Apache families out of hiding to testify about their treatment, despite the risk of federal arrest. And they would let Morrison's own reactions reveal his guilt to a crowd of witnesses. "There's one more thing," Taza said. As the meeting concluded, Morrison's correspondence mentions weapon sales to Apache bands in Mexico. "If we can prove he's been arming the very Indians he claims to be protecting you from, even his allies won't be able to support him. How do we prove that?" Dr. Hartwell asked. Taza smiled grimly. "We asked my cousin Carlos, who leads one of those bands. I think he would be very interested to know who has been selling him defective rifles and watered-down gunpowder." As the conspirators prepared to leave Murphy's store, The donkey appeared at the back door as if summoned. The animal had somehow sensed that important decisions were being made and had come to check on its human companion. "That donkey of yours has been our good luck charm," Murphy said, patting the animal's neck. "If it hadn't found those documents, wisdom finds what needs to be found," Taza replied. "Tomorrow, we begin the work of letting truth speak louder than lies." But as they stepped out into the desert night, none of them noticed a figure watching from the shadows across the street. Jake Rawlings had followed Dr. Hartwell to the meeting, and his face showed the complex emotions of a man wrestling with loyalty and conscience. The flood rescue had changed Rawlings profoundly, but Morrison still held his job, his home, and his family's security in his hands. Now Rawlings faced the hardest choice of his life, whether to warn his employer about the brewing conspiracy or to let justice take its course. As Taza mounted the donkey for the ride back to his camp, he touched the medicine pouch containing Sarah's ring and his grandfather's sacred herbs. Tomorrow would begin the final test of his peaceful approach to conflict resolution. Either truth would triumph over deception, or he and everyone who had supported him would pay the ultimate price for believing that understanding could overcome hatred. The donkey stepped carefully through the darkness, its hooves sure and silent on the desert trail. Behind them, the lights of Copper Ridge flickered like stars, and ahead lay the unknown challenge of exposing a man who had built his empire on lies and violence. But for the first time since arriving in the territory, Taza felt that victory might be possible. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the hope that his people and the settlers might finally find a way to share the land their children would inherit. "I understand but dispute them. I have remained on lands granted to Apache families under territorial treaty." Morrison leaped up, face flushing. "Captain Torres, this agitator has been inciting resistance to federal authority. Remove him immediately, before he spreads more seditious lies." But Judge Bradley raised his hand. "Mr. Morrison, territorial law requires all residents have the right to address grievances. Mr. Taza will be heard, though he remains in federal custody." When Torres moved to restrain Taza, the warrior shook his head. "I will not flee or resist. My word as a warrior should be sufficient bond." "Your word as a warrior means nothing to civilized people," Morrison said with calculated scorn, trying to provoke an angry response that would justify immediate removal. Instead, Taza smiled, stunning. "Everyone present. Mr. Morrison speaks truly. The word of one Apache warrior means little to those who have never learned to value honor above profit. But perhaps many people, speaking together, might carry more weight." At his signal, Joseph Standing Bear rose and began speaking in Apache with ceremonial formality, joined by Mary and other Apache voices in unison. The effect was mesmerizing, sophisticated discourse that spoke of centuries of civilization, not the savage gabbling settlers expected. Sarah rose to translate Standing Bear's formal words. "We call upon the spirits of this land to witness truth. We call upon memory of treaties signed in good faith and broken by greed. We call upon children who deserve a world built on justice rather than hatred." Morrison's face darkened. "This is savage theater, Judge Bradley. I demand you stop this disruption and proceed with arrests." But Bradley was studying the scene with legal interest. "These people appear to be presenting traditional testimony. Unless you can demonstrate immediate danger, I see no reason to prevent completion of their statement." The testimony continued with Standing Bear detailing land grant history, territorial promises, and systematic harassment. Sarah's translation revealed careful legal argument based on documented facts, not primitive rambling. When Standing Bear finished, he withdrew the forged documents bundle from his pouch and placed them on Bradley's table with dignity. Morrison's confidence wavered as Bradley examined the evidence. Dr. Hartwell stood with his medical bag. "Your Honor, May I present supporting evidence of Mr. Morrison's fraudulent activities? Dr. Hartwell, Morrison warned, you're involving yourself in matters beyond your concern. As a territorial resident and physician, I'm deeply concerned about systematic fraud affecting my patients' health and legal rights. Dr. Hartwell's evidence was devastating: medical records of injuries during evictions, correspondence with corrupt officials, and proof Morrison had been selling weapons to Apache bands while publicly calling for military action against Apache. Hostiles? Morrison jumped up, composure cracking. Outrageous fabrication. These people conspired to create false evidence supporting their illegal occupation. His protest was interrupted by Jake Rawlings standing from the back. Mr. Morrison, that ain't true, and you know it. I've been your foreman for 3 years. I've seen what you've done to Apache families. I participated. God forgive me, but I won't watch you lie about it. Morrison's transformation was immediate and alarming. The smooth politician vanished, replaced by barely controlled rage. Rawlings, you're fired. Get out before I have you arrested for conspiracy. You can't fire me because I quit 3 days ago when I realized I'd been working for a criminal. Judge Bradley raised his hand for order as the crowd murmured. Morrison's careful facade was crumbling rapidly, and the territorial representative was seeing the true scope of Copper Ridge's situation. The donkey, quiet throughout proceedings, suddenly raised its head and brayed once a sound that seemed like commentary on the morning's revelations, causing nervous laughter that momentarily broke the tension. But Morrison saw something else in that levity, his narrative of Apache savagery dissolving in the face of reality that included a gentle warrior, dignified elders, innocent children, and a wise donkey, symbolizing persistence against injustice. Morrison's final gambit revealed his complete moral corruption. As evidence mounted and witness testimonies destroyed his narrative, he made the choice to control through violence what he couldn't control legally. His signal was subtle, checking his gold pocket watch ostentatiously. To observers, it appeared nervous habit. The position gunman recognized it as the predetermined sign to begin their final solution. Morrison hadn't anticipated his own employee's crisis of conscience. When the first gunman reached for his weapon, he found his arm seized by a fellow cowboy, one of Morrison's own men, who decided burning out. Children crossed every line. Don't, the cowboy said quietly. There's been enough ugliness. Similar scenes played throughout the hall as Morrison's remaining loyal gunmen found themselves outnumbered by their own colleagues who refused to participate in massacre. But Morrison himself hadn't surrendered. With cold calculation, he drew a concealed derringer and pointed it at Little Dove. "Everybody stop," he shouted. "Judge, dismiss all charges and order these Indians to the reservation, or this child dies." The threat created frozen horror. Little Dove stood perfectly still, more confused than frightened as she looked at the weapon. Around her, adults faced the reality of life and death. Taza felt every warrior instinct screaming to attack Morrison, but heard his grandfather's voice, "Greatest. Victory comes not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them." From his medicine pouch, Taza withdrew his peace pipe, intricately carved with eagle feathers and red stone that glowed in the morning light. "Mr. Morrison," Taza said calmly, "you hold a gun on an innocent child. What victory can such an act bring?" "This isn't about victory anymore," Morrison laughed harshly, gun hand shaking. "This is survival. You've destroyed everything I built. We revealed what you built. Empire built on lies cannot stand when truth speaks." Sarah made the bravest decision of her life, walking directly toward Morrison, placing herself between his gun and Little Dove. "Harrison," she said, using his first name deliberately, "you're not a killer. You're a businessman who made bad choices, but you don't have to become a murderer." "You don't understand what's at stake," Morrison said, voice losing certainty. I understand perfectly. You're afraid that if Apache and white people learn to live together, it proves everything you've done was unnecessary. You're afraid your version of progress was just greed and fancy words. Morrison's gun wavered between Sarah and Little Dove, his face showing internal struggle as his worldview collapsed. I brought civilization to this territory, order and prosperity. You brought fear and division, Dr. Hartwell said, standing. To support Sarah, it is necessary, Morrison shouted. Look what's happening. Apache and white sitting together, children learning savage customs. This isn't civilization. This is destruction. Taza raised the peace pipe toward Morrison, the sacred instrument catching light. My people say, the man who plants hatred will harvest only sorrow. You have harvested well, but it's not too late to plant something different. Don't preach to me, savage. But Little Dove, showing fearless wisdom that comes to children in crisis, began to sing a simple Apache lullaby about sun rising on all peoples, bringing light to every heart. The child's clear voice filled the church with sound that transcended anger and fear. Other Apache voices joined, first Mary, then Joseph, then others, until the ancient lullaby became a chorus of hope rising above violence. Sarah began translating. The sun rises for all children. Apache and white together. The earth holds room for every heart that chooses love over fear. Morrison's gun hand shook violently. Stop it, he whispered. But the song continued, and gradually white voices joined, not in Apache, but humming the melody. Dr. Hartwell, Murphy, others throughout the hall added their voices to the harmony. Captain Torres, moved by what he was witnessing, spoke quietly. Mr. Morrison, lower your weapon. This has gone far enough. Beyond rational thought, Morrison swung the gun toward Taza with a cry of rage. If I can't have my territory, I can remove the man who destroyed it. The shot that followed echoed like thunder, not Morrison's Derringer, but Torres' service revolver, aimed with precise accuracy. Morrison crumpled, wounded in the shoulder, his weapon clattering harmlessly away. Little Dove's voice rose again, continuing the lullaby as if violence was simply another storm that would pass. Taza approached the fallen Morrison and knelt beside him, withdrawing healing herbs from his pouch. Why? Morrison gasped as Taza began treating his wound. After everything I've done, why help me? Because healing is what healers do, Taza said simply. And because my grandfather taught me we defeat enemies not by destroying them, but by refusing to let them make us smaller than we were born to be. Judge Bradley stood to address the crowd that had witnessed territorial history's most dramatic confrontation. I have seen enough evidence to draw clear conclusions about what's been happening here. But more importantly, I've seen something that gives me hope for the future. Looking around the church at Apache and white faces united by shared crisis and resolution, Bradley realized he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, a community that had chosen understanding over fear, justice over convenient, lies and healing over hatred. Morrison's final gambit revealed the true depth of his desperation and moral corruption. As Judge Bradley continued examining the evidence and witness testimonies mounted against him, the cattle baron made a choice that would define him for history. He decided that if he couldn't control the narrative legally, he would control it through violence. The signal was subtle, Morrison removing his gold pocket watch and checking the time ostentatiously. To most observers, it appeared to be nervous habit. But beyond the men he had positioned throughout the crowd, recognized it as the predetermined sign to begin their final solution. What Morrison hadn't anticipated was that his own employees had been wrestling with their consciences since the flood rescue. When the first gunman began reaching for his weapon, he found his arm seized by the cowboy sitting next to him, one of Morrison's own ranch hands, who had decided that burning out children was where he drew the line. Don't, the cowboy said quietly. There's been enough ugliness. Similar scenes played out around the hall as Morrison's remaining loyal gunmen found themselves outnumbered not by Apache warriors, but by their own colleagues who refused to participate in massacre. The careful coordination Morrison had planned dissolved into confusion as his own men turned against each other. But Morrison himself had not given up. With the cold calculation of a man who had built his empire on violence and fraud, he drew a concealed derringer and pointed it directly at Little Dove. "Everybody stop," he shouted, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent hall. "Judge, you're going to dismiss all charges against me and order these Indians back to the reservation, or this child dies." The threat created a tableau of frozen horror. Little Dove stood perfectly still, her young face showing more confusion than fear as she looked at the weapon pointed at her heart. Around her, adults who had been engaged in legal arguments suddenly faced the reality of life and death. Taza, still technically in federal custody but unrestrained, felt every warrior instinct screaming at him to attack Morrison and protect the child. But he also heard his grandfather's voice speaking from memory. The greatest victory comes not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them. From his medicine pouch, Taza withdrew his grandfather's peace pipe, an intricately carved instrument used in the most sacred Apache ceremonies. The pipe was beautiful, its stem decorated with eagle feathers, and its bowl carved from red stone that seemed to glow in the morning light streaming through the church windows. "Mr. Morrison," Taza said calmly, his voice carrying clearly through the tense silence, "you hold a gun on an innocent child. What victory can such an act bring you? Victory?" Morrison laughed harshly, but his gun hand was beginning to shake. "This isn't about victory anymore. This is about survival. You and your people have destroyed everything I built here." "We have revealed what you built," Taza corrected gently. "Empire built on lies cannot stand when truth speaks." Judge Bradley, recognizing that he was witnessing either the resolution or catastrophe of the entire territorial situation, spoke with careful authority. "Mr. Morrison, threatening a child will not resolve your legal difficulties. Lower your weapon and we can discuss this rationally." "Rationally?" Morrison's voice rose to near hysteria. "There's nothing rational about Apache savages being treated as equals to civilized white men. There's nothing rational about giving away land that white blood and white labor opened up." It was then that Sarah McKenna made the bravest decision of her life. She stood slowly and walked directly toward Morrison, placing herself between his gun and Little Dove. "Harrison," she said, using his first name deliberately, "you're not a killer. You're a businessman who made bad choices, but you don't have to become a murderer." "Sarah, don't," Morrison said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You don't understand what's at stake here." "I understand perfectly," Sarah replied, continuing to walk closer. "You're afraid. Afraid that if Apache and white people learn to live together peacefully, it will prove that everything you've done was unnecessary. Afraid that your version of progress was really just greed dressed up in fancy words." Morrison's gun wavered between Sarah and Little Dove, his face showing the internal struggle of a man whose entire worldview was collapsing. "I brought civilization to this territory. I brought order and prosperity. You brought fear and division," Dr. Hartwell said, standing to support Sarah. "You convinced people that hatred was necessary for survival." "It is necessary," Morrison shouted. "Look at what's happening here. Apache and whites sitting together. Children learning savage customs, white women defending Indian interests. This isn't civilization. This is the destruction of everything our people fought to build." Taza raised the peace pipe toward Morrison, the sacred instrument catching the light and seeming to glow with inner fire. "Mr. Morrison, my people have a saying. The man who plants hatred will harvest only sorrow. You have harvested well, but it is not too late to plant something different." "Don't you dare preach to me," Morrison snarled. You're nothing but a savage with pretty words." But as he spoke, something extraordinary happened. Little Dove, showing the fearless wisdom that sometimes comes to children in moments of crisis, began to sing. It was a simple Apache lullaby that her grandmother had taught her, a song about the sun rising on all peoples and bringing light to every heart. The child's voice, clear and sweet, filled the church with a sound that transcended all the anger and fear that had brought them to this moment. One by one, other Apache voices joined her. First Mary Standing Bear, then Joseph, then others, until the ancient lullaby became a chorus of hope rising above the threat of violence. Sarah, still standing between Morrison and the child, began translating the song. The sun rises for all children, Apache and white together. The earth holds room for every heart that chooses love over fear. Morrison's gun hand began to shake more violently. "Stop it," he whispered. "Just stop it." But the song continued, and gradually white voices began joining in, not in Apache, which they didn't know, but humming the melody, adding their voices to the harmony. Dr. Hartwell began humming, then Thomas Murphy, then others throughout the hall. Captain Torres, the federal marshal, found himself deeply moved by what he was witnessing. In 15 years of Indian wars, he had never seen anything like this. A moment when two cultures came together not in conflict but in shared humanity. "Mr. Morrison," Captain Torres said quietly, "lower your weapon. This has gone far enough." But Morrison was beyond rational thought now. The song, the faces looking at him with more pity than fear, the complete collapse of everything he had worked to achieve, it was too much. With a cry of rage and desperation, he swung the gun toward Taza. "If I can't have my territory," he shouted, "I can at least remove the man who destroyed it." The shot that followed echoed through the church like thunder. But it was not Morrison's Derringer that fired. It was Captain Torres' service revolver, aimed with the precision of a man who had learned to shoot quickly and accurately in dangerous situations. Morrison crumpled to the floor, his weapon clattering harmlessly across the wooden boards. The cattle baron was not dead, but wounded in the shoulder, disabled, but alive to face justice for his crimes. In the sudden silence that followed, Little Dove's voice rose again, continuing the lullaby as if violence was simply another storm that would pass, leaving the sun to shine again on all people. Taza approached Morrison, who lay bleeding on the church floor. His empire of lies finally collapsed around him. From his medicine pouch, the Apache warrior withdrew herbs that could ease pain and promote healing. "Why?" Morrison gasped as Taza knelt beside him to tend his wound. "After everything I've done to you, why would you help me?" Taza began preparing a poultice from his medicinal plants, his movements gentle despite the hatred Morrison had shown him. "Because healing is what healers do," he said simply. "And because my grandfather taught me that we defeat our enemies not by destroying them, but by refusing to let them make us smaller than we were born to be." As Dr. Hartwell joined Taza in treating Morrison's wound, Judge Bradley stood to address the crowd that had just witnessed the most dramatic confrontation in territorial history. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge said, his voice carrying new respect, "for everyone present, I have seen enough evidence today to draw some clear conclusions about what has been happening in this territory. But more importantly, I have seen something that gives me hope for what might happen in the future." The donkey, which had remained calm throughout even the gunfire, walked over to where Little Dove stood still singing and nuzzled her gently. The child's hand found its way to the animal's neck, and her song gradually faded into peaceful silence. Looking around the church at Apache and white faces united by shared experience of crisis and resolution, Judge Bradley realized he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in territorial history. A community that had chosen understanding over fear, justice over convenient lies, and healing over hatred. 6 months later, the wedding blanket Sarah had woven with Apache unity symbols spread beneath the cottonwoods where Taza first camped. The ceremony about to take place would have been unthinkable when he arrived. A marriage between an Apache warrior and white schoolteacher, blessed by both Apache elders and the territorial judge, who witnessed their community's transformation. The donkey wore ribbons and flower garlands. Having become such a beloved figure, the children from 3 counties sent gifts for wisdom's ceremony roll. The animal seemed to understand its importance, standing with patient dignity. Judge Bradley had returned specially, bringing news that Morrison's criminal investigation exposed territorial corruption reaching the highest levels. The cattle baron, recovered from his wound but facing federal prison, had testified against his co-conspirators. Dozens of families, Apache and white, would have stolen lands restored. Remarkable how one man's peaceful commitment transformed an entire region. Judge Bradley told Dr. Hartwell, "We're using Copper Ridge as a territorial integration model." Dr. Hartwell nodded toward Taza receiving Apache elder blessings. It wasn't one man. It was a community choosing wisdom over fear, courage over comfort. Their medical partnership had exceeded all expectations. The clinic treating patients with integrated healing traditions had attracted attention from medical schools nationwide. Dr. Hartwell's university presentations have been so successful that 3 schools requested permission to study their approach. Sarah's integrated school had become territorially famous. Apache and white children learning together produced test scores exceeding every other Arizona school. More importantly, it created young people who saw cooperation rather than conflict as natural. Little Dove served as classroom bridge between cultures, helping white children understand Apache customs while mastering English literacy with remarkable skill. Her laughter had fully returned, showing no fear of white adults' testament to justice's healing power. Thomas Murphy's store had become an unofficial community center where Apache crafts sold alongside conventional goods. The economic partnerships benefited everyone. Apache families gained stable income while settlers accessed superior desert knowledge. Even Jake Rawlings found redemption through territorial service, helping identify fraudulent land claims throughout Arizona. His intimate knowledge of Morrison's methods made him invaluable in restoring justice to victimized families. As afternoon sun reached perfect ceremony angle, Taza took his place wearing traditional Apache wedding attire, blessed by 3 generations of holy men. The buckskin shirt's intricate beadwork told his journey from warfare to peace. Sarah approached in a dress blending Apache and Eastern traditions, white silk decorated with native patterns. Mary Standing Bear had helped design eagle feathers, gifted by Apache elders, adorned her hair. The ceremony uniquely combined traditions. Standing Bear began with Apache prayers honoring land spirits, asking blessings on the Union. Judge Bradley followed with territorial legal requirements, making their marriage recognized by both cultures. But their exchange of personal vows moved everyone to tears, speaking not just of love, but commitment to bridge building between peoples. I promise to honor your people's wisdom, Sarah said clearly, and teach our children that strength comes from understanding, not dominance. I promise to share my ancestors' healing knowledge, Taza replied, and show our children that true warriors fight to create friends, not destroy enemies. When Bradley pronounced them married and Standing Bear blessed their union, celebration followed with traditional Apache dancing, community feast featuring both cultures' foods, and music blending traditions into something entirely new. The donkey wandered among guests, accepting treats with dignified grace, having become a symbol of wisdom triumphing over prejudice. Children who once feared the scary Apache now competed to feed the animal that represented their community's transformation. As evening approached under lantern-lit cottonwoods, Captain Torres brought news from the territorial capital. The federal government officially recognized the Copper Ridge Compact. You are being considered for first Apache territorial representative appointment. Taza looked across celebration at integrated families sharing food, children playing together regardless of race, elders exchanging stories. I'm honored, Captain, but my work is here, nurturing what we've planted. Don't underestimate your example's impact, Torres replied. What happened here is spreading. People are beginning to believe cooperation might be possible where only conflict seemed inevitable. Sarah joined them, wedding dress decorated with children's flower petals. What serious discussion at my reception. The future, Taza replied, taking her hand toward where the donkey stood under stars. And how sometimes the most important victories prevent wars rather than win them. Looking over their community, former enemies sharing meals, children playing. Blended tradition games, families united by justice rather than divided by fear. Sarah felt profound completion. Remember what you said that first day about Earth belonging to no man, that we're all her children? Taza smiled, hand on the donkey's neck while embracing his wife. I think I was wrong. The Earth belongs to all of us together. We're not just her children, but her caretakers, responsible for leaving something better than we found. The donkey raised its head towards star-filled sky and brayed once a sound carrying both celebration and promise across the desert night. Little Dove ran over from the celebration fire. Uncle Taza, grandmother says plant spirits are happy tonight. She says they feel healing has come to this place. What do you think, little dove? Sarah asked. Do you feel the healing? The child considered seriously, then nodded. The burns don't hurt anymore, and I don't feel scared looking at white people. I think the healing worked. As celebration continued and the donkey grazed peacefully under cottonwoods, Taza reflected on their long journey. He'd sought peace and found the opportunity to prove peace was possible in the most unlikely circumstances. The donkey that once symbolized mockery had become persistence, wisdom, and quiet dignity's power to transform hearts. The warrior who'd sworn never to use his father's lance in anger discovered that greatest victories came not from fighting but healing. The laughter that once mocked an Apache warrior riding a donkey had transformed into children's laughter. Playing together, families celebrating together, communities building toward a future where difference was celebrated rather than feared. Under Arizona's vast sky filled with stars that witnessed countless generations of conflict and peace, the wedding blanket represented more than two hearts. Union, it represented hope's triumph over hatred, understanding over ignorance, love over fear. The donkey, wise beyond its humble appearance, seemed to understand its work was complete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose bridge building over wall building, new chances to prove dignity and persistence could overcome any obstacle. Tonight there was celebration, community, and profound satisfaction. That the world was a little more healed than before one Apache warrior and one stubborn donkey decided to answer mockery with grace, hatred with healing, fear with friendship.